Well, it's great to be continuing with this this great series, which is Old School. If you are a visitor, let's put in context what's going on this morning. We're revisiting some things that used to be held without question within the churches. But over time, things do sometimes change in terms of accent and importance. And we're doing this as a sort of old school, going back to some basics that I suppose a different generation might have looked at in a different way to the way we conventionally do today. Does that make sense to you? That's right. Just wondered what was going to happen. Thought you were going to sneak up behind me, but you weren't. And so I've been asked to speak this morning, are you ready? On meekness. Meekness. So this is all about the meek. Now, as soon as you've got a topic, you start to think, well, where's the scripture reference on this? Where do I start? How do we start to unpick the whole thing about meekness? And I suppose if you hear the word meek, there's a few things start to run through your mind. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, look on me, a little child. If I should die before I wake. There we go, that's it. I knew somebody would help me out. So gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Jesus as an embodiment of meekness probably is shaped by the way we think about the topic of meekness. So if our understanding of meekness is wrong, it may be that our understanding of Jesus isn't quite correct either. So that's good. Let's go back. And I suppose the other thing that might immediately strike you is the question of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they will. Right. So if you want to inherit the earth, become meek. But it's hard to imagine what a congregation who is meek, what they look like. Because I think we largely misunderstand what the word means. So this is back to basics. If I say meek, we get this idea probably of gentle, submissive, easily imposed upon. But actually that is not correct, as we're going to see whatsoever. We've had 5 people leave and come in and out that door. So if you don't mind me being, I'm not going to be rude. I'm going to will you please regard the Word of God with due reverence and stop going in and out? Is that all right? If it's a severe issue of control and you have to go. But please, otherwise, can we focus on this? Because it's very, very distracting. I hope you don't mind me saying that. If we go back to the Beatitudes, one of the things that we probably misunderstand about the Beatitudes is the way that they express a certain feeling. So, for example, when it says, blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth. We have to look at that original form of what Jesus said. And if we start to unpick it, instead of it being a sort of declaration about, blessed are the poor in spirit, for example, the words actually spoken by Jesus are, or the blessedness. So we're in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. So all of the Beatitudes is best understood as an expression of Jesus going, the blessedness of this. So, for example, when it comes to the blessedness of the poor in spirit, Jesus is saying, the blessedness of those who are so poverty-stricken inside in the spirit that they have to rely upon God. You get that? So Jesus was never saying that poverty is good. What he was saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who recognize their unworthiness before God, because if they find themselves in that position, they will be able to receive from God. Right? Well, that's what we're coming to here. Or the blessedness of being meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So the blessedness. Now, this idea of meekness isn't an idea of spinelessness and subservience or mean-spiritedness. No father would sit a child in the way that we think in conventionally. No father would sit a child on his knee and say, now, son, you can imagine them saying, now, son, you must be strong. Now, son, you must be brave. Yeah? But it's hard to imagine any father sitting a child on his knee and saying, now, son, you must be meek. Yeah? Steppenwolf didn't sing Born to be Mild. But the word in Greek is praus. And it is one of the great Greek ethical words. Now, I've got to talk a little bit about language to start with here, so you understand it. Language changes through time. So words that we think mean something now are busy changing. So if we went back 60 years and said, are you feeling gay this morning? We would mean, do you feel sprightly? Do you feel happy? Have you got a spring in your step? But now if we go to somebody and say, are you feeling gay this morning? Well, the response is likely to be a bit different. If you say to some kids, that activity's wicked. Right? Now, 60 years ago, it would be saying that activity is wrong. But now if we say that activity is wicked, they'll go, yeah. Well, so what I'm saying, this is not an argument about language. This is just acknowledging that words change in their meaning over time. And that's how we caught with this problem over the word meekness. And one of the, we get writers in our language that sort of impact upon the way that people speak. So, for example, we could traditionally look at Shakespeare, and there's so many of the expressions that Shakespeare have used that's entered into our language. Now, if we turn the clock back and we go into the Greek language at the time of Jesus, most of that, well, not most, but a lot of the language that was used at that time had been shaped by a guy called Aristotle, who was one of the great Greek philosophers. But he wasn't just a philosopher. His writings, if you like, became so important to the Greeks that they would use the words in the way that he would use them. And one of the words that he would use would be praus, which is translated as meekness. But rather than being a weak word, was actually one of the strongest words that could be used. So this idea of praus was about being in self-control. So nothing about weakness, but entirely about self-control. So, for example, one of the things that Aristotle would do, he'd sort of try and say, this word is like in the middle of either that word or that word. So let me try and explain a bit more. So, for example, let's take the idea of spending money, right? On one hand, you've got the person who can't keep money in their pocket, right? Because as soon as they pass a shop, they will go, oh, got to have that. And they go in and they buy and buy and buy. And we tend to call that person what? A spendthrift. So we get that. It's great now with contactless, isn't it? Yeah? Because you can go into a shop, just wave a magic wand, and you don't have to pay for anything. It's wonderful. All these things free. All you've got to do is wave a piece of plastic in a machine, and you can walk out with goods. So you get the idea that spendthrifts are excessive. But on the other hand, for example, you might find somebody, and you might know some people like this. I've got to be very careful where I look now around the church, in case you think I'm focusing on people. So, you might know some people who seldom, in fact, you can't tell me what color their wallet is. because you've never seen them take it out their pocket. You know the type of person. Everybody's buying a round of coffee or whatever. And when it comes to their turn, I've left my wallet in the house. I'll get it next time. Now, what this word is about is balance. Neither the spendthrift or the miser. Do you get it? This is what Aristotle was using this word for, meekness. It's like, on one hand, there's the extreme of excess, and on the other side is the extreme of deficit. And there is in the middle a happy medium. So the word equally can be defining meekness as the difference between extreme anger and extreme passiveness. Now, that's a funny one, isn't it? We're going to see that all anger isn't wrong in a minute. Anger, Paul says, be angry but sin not. So anger is a funny old thing because we can be necessarily angry, but we have to be very careful in those situations that we don't sin. So, for example, when it talked about Moses in the Old Testament, it said that he was the meekest man alive. Now, that didn't mean to say that he was a person who had no anger in him at all. In fact, we can think of 2 occasions in the life of Moses where he was angry inappropriately, and it cost him a great deal. When he struck the rock and shouldn't have, and he struck it in anger because of the wickedness of the people around about him and their lack of faith. He was rightly angry because in that situation, God was angry with the people. But unfortunately, he found his anger spilled over into inappropriate action. And at that point, it was disaster for him personally. We also see Moses at the other part of his life, if you like, as a 40-year-old. And he's in Egypt. He sees the guards beating up a Jew. He's a secret Jew. He's been brought up in the palace. Everybody thinks he's Pharaoh's kid. But he knows his true heritage. And when he sees the people being put upon, he is necessarily angry. But again, what does he do? Instead of doing what God wanted him to do, he ends up killing the bloke. And then for 40 years, he's on the run before he's in a position again to be used by God. So one of the things this morning that I want to delve into, and it's a problem, I've got to admit it's a problem. How do we get angry at the things we should be angry about, but make sure that we don't sin? I'm going to just look at this idea, if you like, and try and unpack that beatitude as we go through. But meekness is the happy medium between too much and too little anger. So what we might be able to do is start with that beatitude and apply this to it first and say, blessedness, or the blessedness of the man who's angry at the right time, but never angry at the wrong time. Is that okay? Can we take that this morning? Now, there's a general rule for being angry in an appropriate way. And that anger is always about other people and not about preservation of your own dignity or your own needs or your own rights. What I mean is righteous anger is when you come to realize that you need to act on behalf of somebody who is powerless. You understand? It's never about you. It's never in defense of you. It's always standing up for what is right. It's sad that today we are passive in many ways. And I think it's a deficit within the church. It's interesting that today, if you go outside and see somebody with a sign that says, repent, the end is nigh. Do you know how that's likely to be and what it's likely to be about? It could be a 16-year-old schoolgirl saying, repent, you're killing our planet. The end is nigh, we're going to die. No, I'm not suggesting that we should all become avid protesters of that, because we might have some views that need to be unpacked about that. But it's interesting, isn't it, that the world's become activists at the very time that we've stopped. Isn't that strange? We've become passive, and everybody out there's on the streets. If we go to Hong Kong and see all those umbrellas and all the masks, if you see Extinction Rebellion wearing the masks as they come out that tube station, you see hundreds of them together all wearing the same mask. It's wow, it catches your attention. I'm not talking about the issues here, people, right? I'm not talking about that, but what I am talking about is what it is that makes some people rise up and get off the backside and protest. And why do they do it? They protest because they're angry. Friends, there are things in our society going on today that is disgusting, and we should be angry. Not being funny, but how on earth can we sit in our seats and not shout when we know that a 16-year-old girl in Romania is probably at this point in time, in her innocence, applying for a job as a nanny somewhere? And the organization she's applying to say, oh, we'll sort out all your transport for you, pet. You can come to London and you'll be working as a nanny in a nice house from some rich people. And as soon as she gets on the minibus that crosses the border and the doors of the minibus are locked, she will never get out again. She'll be taken to accommodation where she'll be heavily abused by multiple men. She'll be given drugs until she's compliant. She'll be beaten. They'll do anything until she's in the place where she'll do what they tell her to do, and she's so scared that she can't run away. And we know this is happening every day. Right now, there are people filling in application forms, and right now, there are people sitting in transit vans. And right now, there are other people sitting in houses with the doors locked in filth. There are times, people, when we should be getting angry. There are times when we should be righteously angry. Because unfortunately, we're living in a world that is, well, blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth. We need a meek church. We need the people who are neither excessively angry, but we so need a church that isn't passive, that can't be bothered, where the television program dulls the senses of anger because it's easy. And we feel that we do our duty because we come and worship together. And we sing songs, and it's wonderful. And it's good to worship. But be aware that our service to God lies not in our service just to God, but our service to God lies in our service to others. How can we not be angry when we see people on the streets who are homeless? How can we not be angry? We often tell ourselves, well, they deserve to be there because they've got drug addictions or whatever. Why have they got drug addictions? We know from fact of people that we've closely been connected with who've come out of that world. And we know that as children they were abused. Put into care homes where they're abused. No wonder they're living homeless. And I'm not talking about putting 5 pence or 10 pence or whatever in every cup of every beggar that we pass. I'm not talking about that at all. But what I am talking about is we are belonging to a democracy and a citizenship where actually your voice can count. I told you, Luke, this is going to be a tough one this morning because I haven't a clue where I'm going. I don't. It gets worse. I'm going to go to some places I don't know how to get out of in a minute. It's never right to be angry for insult and injury done to ourselves. But selfish anger is wrong. Selfless anger can be one of the great moral dynamics of this world. That word prowess has a second standard Greek usage meaning. It's a word that was used often about an animal being trained. So, for example, when you get a dog, you don't let it do its business in the corner or the center of the room. You train it to go outside and do what it needs to do out there. It was used in a stronger sense because it was often used in terms of the animals in the games, where, I suppose a circus would be our modern concept of it. Where we see the lion tamer who's taught the animals to do tricks. And I know that's not a good way to have lions in the UK. I'm not in support of that. Or what about Britain's Got Talent, where somebody's got 15 dogs all dancing on the hind legs or whatever? The word prowess had that type of meaning attached to it as well. In other words, the quality is this, where not only do you feel the right amount of anger or something, where you're self-control between the two, but you've become trained to do that. Now, the interesting thing is this is not natural to us. We always want to be angry about ourselves. It's my right to do this. How dare they tell me not to do that? That's our instinct. But what God wants us to do is to train us so that we can control ourselves, so that we can be people who are genuinely the meek, the people who can turn the other cheek when we're slapped, the people who can, the Roman soldier, it was said, could ask you to carry his bag for a mile. And Jesus said, if someone does that, volunteer to carry it for 2 miles instead. Graciousness. That doesn't come natural. That feeling of, he's asked me to do this, that's the natural. But we must train ourselves instead to be kind. And we must train ourselves to be generous. This microphone's just ringing slightly. Can you just do something about that if you don't mind? Oh, switch off the amp. Yeah, there's nothing coming through there. That's all. All right, okay. Sorry about that. So let's go back to this beatitude again. Let's add to this beatitude. Blessed is the man who has every instinct and impulse and every passion under control. Blessed is the man who is entirely self-controlled. Can you see how that is the blessed are the meek? Let's just nudge that a little bit further. Because what we're after in life is not self-control. What we're after is God-controlled. Blessed is the man or the woman who is prepared to train themselves to avoid excess and to respond to what God says in every minute. The God-controlled. Wow. This is meek. This is meek. There was another way that it was used, and it was translated and contrasted with something. And it was sort of lofty-heartedness it was contrasted with. And in a sense, instilled in this word, and probably this is why it's remained slightly like this today, is actually the idea of humility. The idea that we can be trained. The idea that we do not know best. There was one of the great Roman teachers who said of his scholars, they would no doubt be excellent students if they weren't already convinced of their own knowledge. No man can teach the man who knows everything already. It's the acknowledgement of the fact that we understand before God that we need to be taught things because we haven't got it right. It's the idea of understanding the love of God starts with the idea of being unworthy. In fact, you can't understand the love of God unless you start with the idea of being unworthy. It's impossible. And without humility, there is no true religion, because true religion begins with a realization of our own weakness and of our need for God. We don't want the fake stuff. We want the real stuff. Man only reaches true manhood when he's conscious of the fact that he is the creature and God is the creator, and that without God he can do nothing. Meekness describes the humility, the acceptance of the need to learn, and the necessity to be forgiven. And so if we want to build that idea into the Beatitude, blessed is the man who has the humility to know his own ignorance and his own weakness and his own need. And this is the meekness that Jesus said will inherit the earth. Now then, I want to take you to the temple. I don't know if you can picture it in your mind's eye in Jerusalem. This second temple, as it was called, which we could argue about the numbers, but it's referred to as the second temple. The first one, of course, was built by Solomon. And then after it was wrecked and ruined and people were carried up into captivity, Nehemiah came back and rebuilt the walls. Hezekiah had done a lot of work previously to the temple, and I'll describe some of the things he did in a moment. But we're at the temple, and it's a normal day. And it's a very, very busy day because it was raucously busy in the temple. There are 3 great feasts that all the Jews were told to be at the temple for. Passover, which is usually in April. In fact, I'll just quote where they are in this particular year. Shavuot, which is Pentecost, which took place in May. And Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, would be in October. And each of these festivals, every Jew who was near enough to get to Jerusalem was obligated to be there. So that meant the whole land was on the move. Size of Wales. Or maybe like the majority of it, if you think about it, was like Newcastle to Thirsk. About that distance. And everybody in that place would come to Jerusalem. We know Jesus is at a feast. And he's sitting down. And he's doing something. He's making something. Now, all around him, the pilgrims are arriving. And as they do, they encounter money changers and merchants. We find the whole system of sacrifice meant that it was very difficult for some of the pilgrims who were coming here. If you lived outside of Israel, you had to still visit once in your lifetime at least. So there'd be people coming from Rome, and every time you came to Jerusalem, you would have to bring a sacrifice. Now, not being funny, but you ain't going to catch a lamb in Rome and stick it in your suitcase or your backpack. I can just see the little head popping out and the legs out, you know. You're not going to do that, are you? You're going to buy it when you get to Jerusalem. And of course, the other reason was that these animals had to be inspected and they had to be of sufficient quality. I won't go into what those qualities were, but they had to be sufficient quality in order to be suitable to be sacrificed. But if you bought at one of the shops, they would all be pre-stamped approved. And most of these shops were owned by Annas ben Seth. Annas ben Seth was the high priest at the time of the birth of Jesus. He had 5 brothers. Some people think that when Jesus told the story about the rich man and Lazarus, he was actually borrowing some of the family details of Annas to sort of have a poke, you know? And it's interesting, of course, that he calls the poor man Lazarus. Because later on, the real Lazarus is going to rise, which in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, you know, the rich man's saying, let somebody go back and tell them. Jesus knew Lazarus was going to be resurrected, and he uses the name in the story. And yeah, by the by, Annas owned nearly all of the concessions that sold the animals to the buyers who came to the temple. Let me tell you, the prices were so bad. At one point, Gamaliel actually intervened and reduced the price of some of the sacrifices that you could buy by 99%. In other words, doves were selling for £100, and Gamaliel steps in and says, yeah, we can't do this. And they start selling for £1. Can you imagine what it was like? You've come all the way from Rome. You've come all the way from Babylon. You've traveled maybe from Ethiopia. You've come, and of course, everybody's buying souvenirs. Well, you do, don't you? I don't know if they sold snow globes or, you know, they didn't have plastic, which is a good thing. But I'm sure you could buy something to take back that had a little engraved image of the temple on it that you could sort of give to your nanny. You know, thought of you while I was away. Sorry. But what happens, all these pilgrims come together and they'll need room and the board and souvenirs. And everyone was obliged to pay half a shekel in temple tax. Every Jew throughout the whole Roman Empire or wherever they lived, or the Babylonian Parthian Empire, wherever they lived, they had to send their half shekel temple tax. Now, of course, the currencies of their native land was a problem. Because what on earth do you put on a coin? What do you put on? The head of the ruler. Right, but you're not supposed to be making graven images. Right? Now, in fairness, let me tell you a little secret, because a lot of people don't know this. There's actually permission to pay for all this stuff with graven images on it, as long as you don't use it for jewelry. So that actually they weren't that particular about it. But what they were worried about was something more sinister for them, which was they never really knew how much gold or silver was in a coin. So somebody comes from backwoods Turkestan, who happens to live there, and they bring the Turkestani coin. The temple was like, phew, how do we know what this is worth? So you had to change your money. And you had to change your money for temple money. And so the money changers would be there. There would be bankers there as well. And the banking system was quite advanced. So you could go into Rome to a Jewish bank, and you could say, I'm paying you £100 there because I don't want to travel with £100 on me. And they would get a letter with a seal on it, and they'd be able to take it to another guy in Jerusalem and present that, and they would say, oh yeah, that's proper, there's the £100. So there would be those sort of money transfers. It goes farther back than we might think. A lot of people think it starts the Crusade. It starts before that. And there would have been bankers here. But there would also be the money changers who would know every coin that comes, how much silver content it has in it. And then the next thing they would do is they'd look at the coin and they'd examine the edge. Because you know what some people do, don't you? Take little bits off. Yeah? Shave a little bit off a coin, put it in the pot, do it often enough, and your pot's full of little bits of coin, melt it down, and you've got a lump of gold or silver. So the other thing the money changers would do, they'd look at the edges of the coin. Has it been shaved? So all of that's quite legitimate. There's nothing wrong with banking. There's nothing wrong with changing your money. There's nothing wrong with the temple actually guaranteeing that they're being paid in real currency. Is that fair? They used to love the half shekels of Tyre because it had the best reputation. Even though it had an image of the pagan god of Tyre, but never mind. They always used to take them. Now, these traders, or rather these pilgrims who would come, would buy their animals. And the reason is that in Israel, in Leviticus, it tells us there are different types of sacrifices that you can make at the temple. So, for example, you could buy a sacrifice as a burnt offering. This is the most extravagant sacrifice that you give up. And this would be a whole bull or sheep or goat, even a bird. But the whole animal was burnt on the altar. Nothing would be left whatsoever. It would just be one of Luke's barbecues. Sorry. No, he's good, really, honest. He's the only guy I know that can have every form of meat ever invented on a single barbecue. But that was the most extravagant because it was the offering that was totally burned up. But then there was the grain offering. And the grain offering was offered with fine flour or baked goods mixed with oil. And a handful of the offering would be burnt, and the rest went to the priests. And again, right and proper. Because the priests, when they were given the role as priests, didn't have a portion of land. So what happened was the whole of the nation tithed. And it supported the priesthood. Good idea. And then what happened was the portion of the sacrifice was given back to the priests for them to eat later. And then there was the sacrifice of well-being, the fellowship offering. And again, it could be an animal. But what happened here was that the innards, the fat, the kidneys, part of the liver was burnt on the altar. But most of the animal was eaten and divided between the person bringing the sacrifice and the priests themselves. Then there was the sin and purification offering. And that dealt with disruption in your relationship with God between humans and God. And this was depended on the status of the person. For example, a chief priest had to bring a whole bull, whereas ordinary Israelites brought a female goat or a lamb. And if you were too poor again, you could bring birds. And if you remember when Jesus was born, they brought the sacrifice of 2 turtle doves. In other words, the poorest of the sacrifices. So Jesus' family wasn't wealthy. And then there was separately the guilt offering. And again, that was if you'd done something particularly wrong, and I'll leave it there. All I'm saying is there's 5 different types of sacrifices going on. So just now imagine, if you can, that you've got probably 500,000 people in the temple grounds. And then, in addition to that, every one of those 500,000 people has got some form of animal with them, or buying some form of animal. And all that 500,000 people have to be able to change their money. It wasn't like going into a cathedral. It wasn't posh silence. Do you know what I mean? I love the way they built those cathedrals. You go in, you don't feel the presence of God. You might, but what you do feel is awe. Because you go inside and go, oh. No. But you do. You go inside and you are literally awed by the building. And if somebody was to, I was going to be crude there, but if somebody was to say something out loud, everybody would go, shh. Do you know what I mean? If somebody had mobile phone went off in the middle of a cathedral, can you imagine what would happen? There'd be war on, yeah? There'd be people running down the aisles. There'd be people pointing the finger. But if you went into the temple, it was mayhem. The noise the animals would be making would be horrendous. That poor wee sheep you've bought is looking at all the sheep ahead in the queue. Looking at the great big altar and the priests with their knives and going, gulp. Ah. The noise would be amazing. And sacrifice isn't a do-it-yourself activity. You have to have the priests. And so they're standing there. And then what happens to the blood? The blood has to be poured. This is gruesome stuff, it really is. The blood is poured out. These priests are not standing in posh gear. They're in their butcher's work clothes. Seriously. But we still find Jesus, and he's still working on something. And he's braiding together pieces of leather. Now, what happened when Herod built this temple? He built it on top of the works that Hezekiah had done previously. And what Hezekiah had done is the Temple Mount itself, the top of the Temple Mount, he built out with extra earth embankments. And when Herod came, he extended that. And he built this huge portico, this royal stair, it was Solomon's colonnade, it was often called. Huge, cathedral-like, full of pillars. And there was places you could just sit down in there and you could teach your little group of people. But what was significant about it was this. It wasn't classed as being dedicated and holy. So what they called it instead was the court of the Gentiles. And this meant that if you were a sightseer from Rome, and there were tours to look at the temple from people who weren't practicing Jewish faith, but they would come, and if you look at John's Gospel, Jesus meets a bunch of tourists at one point. I'm going to preach on that sometime. Jesus and the tourists. It's good. You'll like it. But Jesus is sitting in the colonnade. And in this colonnade area, any Gentile could come until they come to the low wall. It isn't very high. But it separates out what was the dedicated temple ground. Now, I don't know here. I'm going to surmise some things. What was it that made Jesus righteously angry? Incidentally, there's two separate occasions. In John, it happens at the beginning of his ministry. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's in the end of Jesus' ministry. And I believe very clearly it happened twice. He was really upset about this. It was a big issue for Jesus. On the first occasion, he takes time to make a whip and braid it of leather. On the second time, he actually sees what's going on, goes back to Bethany in this final week of his life, and then comes back again and overturns the tables. Here, he gets a whip and he drives them out. Now, this verse, or this passage has given some people a great problem. Because one of the problems they've got is, well, did Jesus actually hit an animal with a whip, or did he hit a person? You know what I mean? We're so sensitive on this topic, aren't we? Was there a bloke who went home at the end of the day saying, "Oi, that Jesus fella whipped me. Look at the state of that." Well, not being funny, but one day some people are going to meet Jesus as judge. Forget gentle Jesus, meek and mild. So what we've got is an angry Jesus. Was it because the money changers in the temple, in all that melee that's going on, did they cross that low wall? Were some of them inside the dedicated area? I don't know. What did Jesus see? Did he see people being fleeced by Annas ben Seth, the old high priest whose son-in-law Caiaphas is still the high priest now? If you remember, Jesus is actually hauled in front of Annas in the last week of judgment and the death. All I'm suggesting to you today is something quite simple. It's okay to be angry. But be angry and don't sin. But what being angry looks like is perhaps something that you hadn't considered. Jesus wants us to be angry about sin. He wants us to be angry about injustice. He wants us to be angry. But I've got to say, some people also, and this is my dilemma this morning, some people have used this, and even at the time of Jesus, were using this concept of righteous anger in the wrong way. There were people called the Zealots who took the name from Phinehas. Can you remember the story of Phinehas? A lot of you are just nodding, but you haven't a clue, really. I'll just remind you. I know, it's easier. After Balaam couldn't curse the children of Israel, he said, look, if you want to get these children of Israel, the easiest way to do it, actually, is what you do is you get your daughters, all the bonny lasses, and you bring them along and let nature take its course. And then what will happen is the children of Israel become diluted, and you won't be able to tell one of you lot from one of them. Phinehas saw a Jew going into the tent with the girl. And we know from the description of what happened, what they were doing. Phinehas went in with a spear. And it went straight through the back of the bloke and straight through the belly of the girl and pinned them both to the ground. And there was a plague happening, and it stopped the minute that happened. And the declaration was that that was in the will of God. Scary. At the time of Jesus, there were those, as I say, the zealots, because it said Phinehas had done that in zeal for God. In other words, it was described as righteous anger. And so they themselves said, we have righteous anger against the Romans. And within 70 years of the birth of Jesus, they're going to destroy the whole nation. And a few years later, try it again and literally lose the land for 2,000 years. Jesus doesn't want us to become political zealots. But he does want us to be angry. But as Paul says, be angry, but sin not. I don't know the answer to this. I don't know the limits of genuine righteous anger. I wish I could turn around and say, it looks like this or it looks like that, but I can't. But blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. I'm very conscious of the fact that these type of sermons that we're doing don't lend themselves to altar calls, don't lend themselves to anything other than this. Think about it. Be real. Make a spiritual judgment. Be trained by God. Be controlled. Never excessively angry for a second. Never angerlessness. Is that a word? We'll invent it. Be the meek. Because it's the meek who will inherit the earth. And it won't be this one, but the one that's coming. James says if we see a brother or sister in need, we meet the need. Sometimes, friends, we need to stand against the cause of the need. Sometimes we have to have the determination to turn around and say it's not just rescuing the people in trouble, but how do we stop that happening in the first place? And I haven't a clue what that really means. So God bless you.